Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Utopia from 2013. So, going into this show, man, does it feel like drastically different from the Utopia show. It's a lot of the same, but it's just like the way that they go about it is just like, wow, okay. It's just this show doesn't feel like a show. It feels like a mess, in all honesty. And I just like the one kind of flow and the thing where I don't have to kind of question the show, which is honestly just the Utopia 2020 version, where I'm just easily going like, oh, like I can see where like a lot of stuff was just stolen and copied and pasted from the 2020 version, but it seems like they just put out a better product. In all honesty, like it has nothing to do from where this show is to have been shot. It has nothing to do like from like it has like it just has like, okay, this story is a wild approach that just kind of a lot of times just comes out of right or left field, and I'm just like, wait a minute, what? Like, you could see how there's familiar territory here, but when also looking at it, I'm like, oh, that's their version of Becky. That's their version of Ian. That's their version of Arby, and so on and so forth. Not wildly different, but close to different, none the same. Where we go into this story, and instead of them all meeting at a convention, I guess they meet at a comic book store? Is my clear consensus? Because a chat room still doesn't quite make sense to me. That all of this is to be like held upon a chat room. Then I'm like, okay, wouldn't all of these people be honestly from out of state? This doesn't feel like all of these people are to coincidentally all be locals. It doesn't make sense. People would say it's like, well, there's a local server, there's whatever, there's this kind of thing. Like you can go and I'm like, it would have made a lot more sense if this was like some YouTube thing or some Facebook something or other, where it's like Pokemon Go, where Pokemon Go has like Pokemon Go Minnesota or Pokemon Go Kentucky or Pokemon Go Brazil or whichever. Like that makes a lot more sense than a chat room. So I still don't understand. It feels like a chat room now is like this old fashioned thing that no longer makes sense to me anymore, for people to go into because there's convenient things like social medias. So I think, I don't know, it is what it is, I guess, for the show. Because we still have the 2020 variation that still is to find this is to still have this utopia or dystopia chat room, and that still doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, wouldn't there have been an easier access way for this? But that's just me. So we go on, and we of course have it where in the very beginning of this, I like how they open up this episode with these interesting visuals. Really, just because uh, there isn't much of any visuals past this point. Like that's the one thing about the other show. It's just also just more visually stimulating than what this show is. It's like there's so much about it where it's just all over the place and not as visually stimulating. Um, but yeah, so like overall, like will I probably go further into it? More than likely. I don't know. It all depends on if people want to continue to watch this, then I'll continue to view it. Um, like, plus this is also like an hour of a show, and I'm like, man, this is like I try to watch this the night before, and I'm like, all right, like it's just you really have to be fully on like awake to watch this show, just because it just it doesn't have enough. There's so much about this where I'm like, I could just watch a better version of this. There's so much about this story where I'm like, there's so many holes. There's so many holes. So many things where it feels familiar territory, but it doesn't feel better. It doesn't feel better. It just doesn't overall. So, with that said, let's just go into it. Let's just go into spoilers. The teeing up version of this one is instead of having this group meeting at a convention, they instead go on and meet in a bar. Meet at a and that's not even the whole group. Like, that's just certain portions of people. But again, like, so much about this just feels it's a mess. But let's go into it. Let's do our best to talk about this mess. And let's go into it because it's that double five time yet again to just go into this one. Let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. Again, this spoiler has nothing to do from where it comes from. Where if this is a British version, like, that's why I didn't want to, like, go in and just say, like, oh, this is the British version, oh, this is the UK, Utopia UK. Like, I didn't want to completely go into there and do it this way, just because I'm like, okay, now that I finally am to be talking about this show, and, like, I don't want people to just feel like my reaction upon it is based upon where it comes from, because that's not true. So, with that said, spoilers. So, we go on and we have here a guy named Arby and a guy named Lee, who are to make their way into a comic book store, where we of course have nobody with real legitimate names here, so it doesn't really matter. Besides Arby and besides Lee. So we go on and we have Arby, who is to of course ask via a post-it piece of paper, where is the Utopia manuscript? We have the store clerk who's just like, well, like I sold it, and so the guy's like, from where, from who, from what, and where is also Jessica Hyde? As we start to have a number of people that Lee is to take and put a gas mask or a gas weapon into their face, telling them to breathe this in and you'll just go to sleep, where of course that's a lie. So we go on and we have Arby, who's consistently asking this guy where Jessica Hyde is, and he's like, well, does she work here? Like, was that a customer? Like, if you tell me what they probably purchased, I can probably look that up. And Barbie's just like, well, where's Jessica Hyde? And like, the guy's like, I'm trying to think so hard. I don't know. So we go on and we just have it to where this guy just doesn't say where Jessica Hyde is, because how would he know? And so we end up dousing this guy with gas, and he's to realize that the other guy, that is to say that he was to think that he was asleep, is going to die here, because the store clerk realizes that this kid is dead. And so he's now like, well, I guess I'm going to breathe in this gas and just die. So we transition on here to have Becky, who I guess had a father named Deals, not her having Deals. So that is what it is. So we go on and we have Becky, who is talking and telling us the setup of the Utopia story, because there is no dystopia, it's just Utopia here. We end up having this comic book called Utopia Experiments, and so weirdly we have it to where this comic book doesn't look as professional as the other one did, if the other one even looked close to being like professional. Like, it just looks like where this comic book does look like the paintings of a madman. And the visuals don't make up as much sense as the other version of this comic book does, where it feels like there's so many little hidden details in the other comic book, where this one, it's just like, okay, how could you get anything from this? So we go on and we have Becky trying to sell these to uh, Marcus and Diana, I guess, comic book distributors. And so Becky's trying to sell this comic book to them so that way they can go on and continue to make more of these, because evidently she likes it. She's a fan of it, and so she ends up finding out the history of it, that there was to still be this crazed madman um, who was a schizophrenic and whatever, who eventually ended up killing himself in an asylum somewhere. But before he was to go on and do that, he made these comic books. So we go on here, and we of course have it uh, where Diane and Marcus are just like, well, like, I don't know about this book, like, I don't know. And so Becky's just like, well, you have a bunch of people with like PhDs, like working on Star Wars and Doctor Ho or whatever, or Doctor Whore or something like that. So Becky realizes that she's going nowhere with these people, that it will pretty much seem like this comic book will eventually be a waste to try and re-put out. Because I'm thinking, really, like, you can go on like Velvet Buzzsaw and you can take a bunch of paintings and resell them and make quite a bit of money off of them. But like going on and taking somebody's comic book and stealing that idea and basically having no next of kin to pay royalties to, like, eventually a distributor or eventually a person probably wouldn't want to do that, because it feels like, okay, so like eventually somebody's going to come from behind and sue us, because eventually they will be the next of kin of that guy. And so that just feels like a sticky situation to just go on and do. We also have it to where it seems that none of the characters in this story are to actually know a Jessica Hyde. It's not familiar to them. Whereas in Dystopia, we immediately have it to where Wilson is like, oh, that's a comic book character in my comic book. Where it kind of feels like in this story, like it feels like there isn't like that connection with Jessica Hyde. It's like, who's that? I don't know who that is. So we go on here, and we of course have it where Michael is, I guess, to be some guy who deals with the kind of the trading of vaccines. Like he has something to do with vaccines. Not quite sure, because it seems a lot more vague than the story from before. It seems like this guy is just like, hey, give us this certain vaccine, and they sign for it, and that's... The other story made a lot more sense. So we have this Michael that all of a sudden is having an affair with some lady of the night. And so we end up finding out that this lady of the night is to get pregnant. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like, you would think out of all these women, they would be like rubbers and whatever, because they have to do this kind of stuff all the time. And plus, also, I would want to double check if this kid is mine, because technically, like, I wouldn't buy this right away. But it seems like Michael is quickly here being blackmailed and saying that this kid is his, and so he's gonna have to go on and go and do a certain mission for these guys, this certain mission. So Michael is to go on and call his wife, and so his wife is telling him that's like, well, hey, I love you, and so Michael's like, well, I'm sure you do. So Michael goes on, and he's like, at this point, he's having like a handful of pills, and he's having this alcohol, and I think he's just so tempted to just kind of just end it all here. So, but we go on and have Michael who just can't go through with it, and he just pours this alcohol into the sink, going off to his work to then talk about what uh, vaccines and what things they're going to be signing for and doing and whatever. And so we of course have one of Michael's workers who was saying that, like, well, hey, like, I don't know what, like, we're going to go to this meeting and I'm not sure what this guy is going to be talking about. So, like, I'm going to bring Michael with me, and because it seems like he can figure out what this guy is saying. And so everybody's like, yeah, Michael, Michael, yeah, like, uh, yeah, just dialogue is just eluding me here because there's so many jibber jabber. Like, once we kind of get with the Michael stuff and we're talking about all these vaccines and whatever, that's when I get lost in the weeds because I'm just like, what is this show? So we go on. We have Michael going and meeting up with a guy named Let's, and so Let's is to go on and tell these guys about this Russian flu, and that they should gear up for this vaccine for this Russian flu. And they're like, why should we be doing that? And they're like, well, there might be a strain of this Russian flu that eventually like kills a large sum of people. So like you guys should look into that. And of course, Michael's associate is just like, psh, no. Like, no, there's so many other things that we could be focusing on besides this. This seems like a waste of time. So we go on and we have this guy leave the room, and all of a sudden Michael's alone with this guy named Let's, and he's saying like, well, hey, like, you need to get this Russian vaccine, this Russian flu vaccine, and you need to get it because it's your mission. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean, Michael? Your mission? So all of a sudden Michael is forced to get this vaccine, realizing that these guys are working together trying to blackmail him. And eventually Michael is to re-meet up with his lady of the night at some point, and she's apologizing to Michael, saying, I'm sorry, I'm pregnant. So now that we got all that out of the way, technically, barely, whatever, so we end up having Bijan, that of course is to get a copy of this comic book and this manuscript. And now he's hoarding it over all of his chat room friends that, hey guys, I have part 2 of the Utopia experiments. And they're like, bullshit. Like, all these chat room people are like, nah, I don't believe you, blah, blah, blah. So Bijan is telling him, like, well, hey, how about we all meet at my house? And they're like, no, like, you could be a guy that hurts people. And like, well, Granite's mentioning, after he mentions his Porsche and his this and his that he wants to go on and have everybody meet at the pub where he doesn't show up, where Grant doesn't show up. So they're like, hey, yeah, everybody go to the pub, all wear blue. We have, of course, Ian, that is to be one of these guys who's kind of typing away here. And we find out that this guy is to be an IP guy where he hates his job because it's just so, like, it's so monotonous. It's just kind of pulling teeth what he has to do. And he slacks so often at this job that his boss is just consistently on him. It's like, hey, do your job. Stop messing around with chat rooms. And Ian's like, that's not what I'm doing. And his boss is like, well, really? Because click, you're on a chat room. Like, go on and do your job. Like, and so we have even Ian going and talking to his like superior at his job, saying like, well, how does Martin's like Johnson taste? Like, is it salty? Is it like I guess I'm assuming this guy's boss, just kind of just going on of like, man, like you're such a brown noser and this and that. So we go on and we have Ian who's mentioning that there's a funeral at his home and he has to leave, and of course Ian's boss is saying like, wait a minute, you're not even wearing black today. Like, and you're going to a funeral supposedly? It's like, well, he's wearing a suit and tie, so whatever. So we have Bijan who is to be at his place, kind of waiting to go to this pub, and we have both Lee and Arby who appear here because I don't know how exactly they got this information. I don't know. It seems kind of like that doesn't really like. There's a kind of whole thing here that doesn't hold up of how they got this information, but we of course have it where Arby and Lee are to find Bijan at his house, and so they go on and they kill Bijan, but we end up having Grant who is to know where this guy's house is, and he goes on and steals the comic book and runs off. Like, of course, the other story where Grant is to go and find the one guy, his penthouse, and go on to uh, take the comic book away from him. So we go on here and we had Grant, who we find out is still a kid here. It's not any different than the other story. So Grant was to go on and try and use some tools to open up some guy's car, and so all of a sudden the guy is realizing that this kid is picking the lock, and he's like, hey kid, what are you doing here? And so all of a sudden Grant is like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just a piece of and the guy's just like, well, hey kid, like you're not so bad, like come on. Like, so all of a sudden Grant is to shake the hands of this guy, and all of a sudden we have Grant running off because I guess he had smeared on his hand. It's like, oh, well, now you're a piece of as they run off, and the guy's like, you are an animal. What was the point of wasting time? Grant could have just ran off in the beginning of this. So Grant just wanted to purposely go on and do this whole thing just for this guy could see this kid's face more and to say like, yeah, this kid was trying to jack my car. This is what he looks like. If this kid would immediately run off, like, this guy could have taken a freaking cell phone picture of him, like, had all the time in the world to just, like, this makes there's so much stuff that doesn't add up here. So, Grant goes on and is to make his way to go and get that, the Utopia, or the Utopia Part 2, Utopia Experiment Part 2, like, God, man, did they just really complicate that title this time around? So we now have this group with Wilson, Becky, and Ian, who are the only ones that are to arrive at this pub. There's no Samantha. There's no any number of other people here. There's nobody that they made up for whatever reason. So we are, because this is the original run here. So we go on and we have like Wilson just magically appear. It's like, oh, you're Wilson. Sure. Like, we have this guy who doesn't even wear blue, and they're saying, well, hey, you're not even wearing blue, and he's just like, well, yeah, because like blue doesn't look good on me. Wear it anyways. Like, you have the Really? Like, you don't have a pair of blue jeans? You don't have a... Blue doesn't look good on me. Blue looks good on everybody, but whatever. Anyways, so we go on and we have Wilson, who is to uh, just have these two other people like, hey, do you want to come to my house? And they're like, sure, that sounds great. So we go on and eventually, like, Wilson is take these people to his house, and then we transition to this bunker. And so all these characters are getting drunk, and eventually Wilson is to pass out. So we weirdly have it where both Becky and Ian are thrusting off their clothes, deciding to just go at it right here and now. I'm like, dude, there's like a person right in front of you. I guess you guys are just that desperate to just like pop a nut, so to speak. So we go on and have them like thrusting these things off, and I'm just like, how is this all of a sudden gonna like not gonna work out for some odd reason? And sure, far enough, we have Ian who mentions that his Johnson isn't working, and so both of them are just to fall asleep. So Ian wakes up the next day, and Wilson is to leave a note about how he's going to go off and check about the rest of the group, and that supposedly Becky had effed off. So we go on, and we have, of course, Wilson here, who goes on to find where Bijan is because they're waiting for him for I don't know how long. So Bijan goes to, of course, so Wilson goes to Bijan's house, finding out that there is to be a crime scene being put in place here, and we have a detective who is called Reynolds, who is to go on and tell Wilson, it's like, well, hey, like, your friend, like, took his own life. And Bijan is like, wait a minute, what? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this guy had no kind of tendencies and whatever, and so all of a sudden Reynolds is to say, it's like, well, that's not what his, like, records, his medical records would tell you. And so all of a sudden we eventually have Wilson who's saying, it's like, well, Bijan's medical records was consistently, or was all of a sudden drastically changed from the last 2 weeks, like in a day. Like this makes no sense. So we go on and eventually have Reynolds, this detective, go on and find Arby, because they bump into one another, and Arby kills this police officer. I'm like, yeah, whatever random thing you wanna just do in this show. Just, I didn't feel like Reynolds was like coming up with anything. It seems like this is an open and shut case, but just murder everybody, I guess, Arby. So we have Michael, who is to force his superior to go and sign this paper about the Russian flu. And so while Michael is doing this, we have him consistently distracting him, mentioning that he's having problems at home, that his wife can't conceive, and like things are really starting to fall apart for him, and blah 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 blah. And so his boss is saying, it's like, well, hey Michael, do you need some time off? Do you need some like time away? Do you need some vacation time? And so Michael's like, no, I think I can just get by. So all of a sudden we have it to where Michael is to come into work the next day and find out that his superior that signed over this paperwork is to now get fired, and because that was a big massive mistake. So Michael is to go on and talk with people and be like, yeah, like, I don't know why he signed this Russian vaccine thing, and like, I don't know why he signed for this paperwork. I think that's all on him. And so because this guy's impression was he was signing for some other kind of vaccine. Is like, no, like this is the thing that he signed for. Like we just worked it out. So all of a sudden now this guy is to be fired, and so now we have a new guy coming in here. I guess a guy named Jeff, or God, what is the? Just give me the name, show. Just give me the name. Um, Geoff. Is that Jeff? I'm assuming that's Jeff. I'm gonna go with it. Uh, it seems like a Jeff. Geoff. I'm gonna go on here. So we have this new guy that is to come in and is, of course, to mention here. Well, guys, like I know this is like bad timing for me to come in here and kind of take over and so on and so forth. So we go on and we have Michael who is talking to his new boss, Jeff. And so we go on here and we of course have them talking, and this new boss of Michael's like, you know what, like, seems like you're a guy that gets things done, Michael. Like, I don't know, like I think you and me, like we're gonna really do something here. Like it seems like this boss is really just like, like there's something about you, Michael, because I'm probably with the rabbit, or maybe he is the rabbit, or maybe whatever. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out when the show goes further on here, because we don't know who Mr. Rabbit is. But Becky at the beginning of this episode is to kind of set up the rabbit a little bit better than the other Utopia show does. Because eventually they set up that the rabbit is basically the devil, and the devil comes in like certain kind of forms, kind of like in Ghostbusters where you have like the form of your destructor. Like same thing kind of here with the devil, where it seems like the devil is to come to people as a form that is to kind of please them the most. Like it kind of makes sense for probably the Ghost Rider to eventually go on and see the guy from Easy Rider, because that makes a whole lot of sense. So let me pause here for 1 second. All right. So we go on here and we have Wilson who makes it back to his bunker. And so, of course, we get a torture scene yet again, going from both Arby and Lee going through, and instead of putting like a very few number of things in this guy's eyes this time around to torture him for information, instead they go with like chili and sand and then bleach and then the spoon. And so I'm just like, what does it matter how many things you put into him? It's still going to give you the same exact result, where he doesn't know what they're talking about. He doesn't know who Jessica Hyde is. He like, it just kind of feels like they're like eating up a lot of time to still get nowhere. So we go on and we have them asking Wilson questions, getting nowhere, scooping out an eye, because they of course put chili and sand and bleach in his eyes, which does nothing, but it's both eyes this time around instead of just the one. So so eventually both so Arby again is to leave, and and so again we have Wilson who grabs this gun, and Lee comes back down and is to know there's somebody there, so he eventually shoots Lee and kills him. The guy who, of course, was with Arby. So we go on and we have both Ian and Becky who make it back to see Wilson, and they're like, oh my god, his eyes! And so they go on and they try to doctor him as best they can. And so now, like, Wilson is to be in a lot of pain, but he's like, how am I looking? how do I look? So So we go on here, and at the end of this episode, we all of a sudden have Jessica Hyde just appear out of nowhere and just be like, oh, hey, I'm Jessica Hyde. And I'm like, how do these characters even know who this is? Like, we have no setup to understand who this character is. But I guess with Wilson, he could probably only know who Jessica Hyde is because Arby and Lee were questioning him about this and torturing him. But, like, how do these characters know who this is? There's no real perfect setup here within a comic book page somewhere. That's, like, there's so many holes in this episode. It's ridiculous. But I think that covers most of this episode. There might have been a detail here or there that I didn't get it further into. I'm trying to think if there's anything left unsaid here, because I'm sure there probably is. Let me know in the comments below if there's any big, massive story that I forgot about here. There's a lot of details that I probably didn't know about certain characters because I'm not familiar yet with this version of people. Because it feels like there's a lot of the same old, but there's also a lot of new things here. Like, we don't have like a Dr. Michael Stern in this episode or in this show. We just have a guy named Michael who is to not be the same Michael who just kind of deals in seemingly the buying of selling and whatever of like vaccines weirdly. As if like vaccines are some weird bizarre business of some kind. Um, but yeah, so with that said, I just have to kind of figure out this story a little bit more. And I'm sure there's somebody out there that is a Utopia 2013 expert and whatever that like that's like I feel like this show is kind of like Yellowstone for me, where the pilot episode of Yellowstone, I didn't understand what was going on, and then all of a sudden, the further and further I got in this show, the more I started to understand it more. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm hoping that this show is kind of the same thing, where I go into this and I'm like, okay, like I whatever that pilot episode was, but like the further we got onto it, the more I'm like, ah, okay, all right, like I can understand this. But we'll see. We'll see how this all breaks down into further episodes. So if views go up on this, I will continue to talk about it. If views are to just be non-existent, then I will eventually just be like I can't really justify going and doing this show. So going out of my way to say like balls in anyone's court. But there's only 12 episodes also. It's only 12 episodes. So but I also want to say that probably for this season it'll all probably depend on a lot of new releases because there's some stuff where I just kind of go and like, okay, well this show is just more important. There's more views going out in this one. So, or there will be more views going out in certain projects. So we'll kind of see how this breaks down because there's still a lot of stuff to eventually cover at some point. So with that said, goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.